Okay, welcome to everybody watching this interview with Dr. Ross and myself. There's a bit of a personal connection I have with Dr. Ross. My dad was first found out about Dr. Ross when my dad was teaching the University of Hong Kong physics there, and he invited Dr. Ross to speak on campus in Hong Kong. And obviously, I've got to know Dr. Ross later on through reading his own material and watching his stuff online. Um, I will post links to reasons.org, which is the RTV, Reasons to Believe, which is the organization that Dr. Ross heads up. And Dr. Ross is, for those that don't know, Dr. Ross, he's an astrophysicist trained at the University of Toronto and holds a PhD. And since then, he has done not only a lot of good scientific work, but also is very passionate about reconciling Christianity with science. And I just thank you, first of all, Dr. Ross, for being here. And my first question to you is: could you just give a brief testimony of how you came to the Christian faith?
Sure. Well, I was born, raised, and educated in Canada. I didn't really get to know Christians well until I showed up at Caltech to do postdoctoral research. But I got interested in astronomy when I was 7 years of age. From the age of 7 onwards, I was reading about 4 or 5 books on astronomy and physics per week. And that continued through all my growing up years. I was actually doing research on T-Tauri stars during my teenage years. And when I was 16, I realized that the observational evidence was heavily favoring Big Bang cosmology. And with a Big Bang universe, you got a beginning. If there's a beginning, there must be a causal agent, a beginner. And so as at age 17, I began to search for the cosmic beginner. And I didn't really know where to look, but I thought, hey, a good place to start would be the philosophers. I read the books by Immanuel Kant and René Descartes, and didn't really get the answers I wanted. And so that's when I started to look at the different religions of the world. I looked at the Hindu Vedas, the Quran, the Buddhist commentaries, Zoroastrianism, Baha'i, and I did meet 2 Christians from 30 feet away when I was 11 years of age. They came into our public school. They didn't say anything at all, but they left on the teacher's desk Gideon Bibles. So I was at age 17. I picked up that Gideon Bible that was given to me in a public school and began to read it, and was immediately struck by how accurate it recorded the origin and history of the universe and the Earth and the Earth's life. And so I began to spend about an hour a day studying the Bible, starting at age 17. And by the time I was 19, I realized that everything in this Gideon Bible that spoke about history or science or geography was accurate, and was particularly impressed that it predicted future scientific discoveries, thousands of years ahead of what scientists were able to come up with. And then recognized that the only explanation for that is this book must be inspired by the one that created the universe. So as at age 19, I signed my name in the back of this Gideon Bible, committing my life to Jesus Christ as Creator, Lord, and Savior. And when I showed up at Caltech, that's when I met a serious Christian for the first time. And he told me that the churches in the United States are different than the churches in Canada, that I would find Bible-believing people there. And so I began to attend a church between Caltech and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Within 7 months, that church put me on their pastoral staff to train people how to use science to bring people to the Bible and the Christian faith. And that church helped me launch Reasons to Believe 36 years ago.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's a great story there, and just shows that how God speaks to different people in different ways. So, just before we move on, I want to stress to our to our listeners, the audience, that what the topic we're going to be discussing today in a lot of Christian circles can be divisive. However, what we want to do is just put a view across, and this is the view that Dr. Ross has with reasons to believe. And for those of you that don't know, it is the an old Earth creationist view. Um, but Dr. Ross, could you just please flesh out from your personal experience how your interpretation of Genesis 1 and how you came to Genesis to that interpretation?
Well, not being exposed to Christians or the church, I just looked at the text at age 17 and realized that the first page of the Bible uses the word day for 3 different time periods. I mean, creation day 1, it's using the word day to contrast days and nights. So that's day for the daylight hours. Creation day 4, it's contrasting seasons, days, and years. That's day for 24 hours. But Genesis 2:4 uses the word day to refer to all of creation history. So its day is a long period of time. And I also noticed that with the first 6 creation days, they're accompanied by an evening morning phrase. Evening was, morning was, day 3, day 4, day 5, etc. And I didn't really know what the Hebrew words for evening and morning were, but I knew at a minimum it was telling me each of these days had a definite time of beginning and a definite time of ending. I anticipated seeing an evening morning phrase for the 7th day, but it's not there. There is no evening morning phrase. And as I read on in the Bible, I found Psalm 95 and Hebrews 4 that tell us we're still in God's 7th day. So it told me that these days had to be consecutive long periods of time. And, when I was growing up, my parents were really worried that I was being obsessive about astronomy and physics. And so they tried to encourage me to study other things than astronomy and physics. And they bought our family a big, thick book on evolutionary biology. I was the only one that read the book in our family. And I told my parents, the numbers don't add up. We have all these new life forms coming into existence before humanity and very little afterwards. But when I picked up this Bible and began to go through it, I realized this answers the fossil record enigma. For 6 days, God creates. On the 7th day, he ceases from his work of creation. So that explains why we see all these new phyla and classes and orders before humanity, but after humanity, it's static. We don't see any new phyla or classes or orders coming into existence. And the Bible explained to me something that had bothered me since I was 11 years of age. Why this discrepancy between what happens before humanity and after humanity? For 6 days, God creates. On the 7th day, he stops. And it wasn't until 9 years after I'd been a Christian that I even met anyone who thought that these days were 24 hours. It just seemed so clear to me, looking at the text, that they had to be 6 consecutive long periods of time, followed by a 7th long period of time. And Genesis 2 worked that way too, because I noticed that there had to be a passage of time between the creation of Adam and the creation of Eve. I mean, he undergoes several careers before Eve shows up, and God notices that he's alone. And, like most men, it takes a while to feel alone. So I don't think there's just a few minutes.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you for sharing that and how you came to that. I myself, I find for our audience there that the Hebrew word for day, yom, has got multiple meanings. One could be just daylight hours in a day, or a 24-hour period of time, or another another meaning, which is a long but finite period of time.
Right.
And so the RTB model is for a literal yom
Right.
translations, but long, definite periods of time consecutively. So we don't. It's not a metaphorical view, and this, for me, me as because I trained as a scientist as well, but when I was introduced to Dr. Ross's work, and this was my first time I had heard of this Hebrew word yom, and the potential that it can be translated as a long but finite period of time, it really, wow. So what I see at university with the age of the universe and the age of the earth, and what also for me as a scientist, the order of events laid out in Genesis 1 with the plants coming before the animals is exactly what, if you were to talk with a biologist at any university, they will say yes, plants did come before the mammals, and so on. So what for me, the Bible is so powerful. If you think about when Genesis was written thousands of years ago, and it has made this prediction, or at least this account, which when we look at modern day science is just wonderful. And for our listeners, I just want to make the point that you can translate the word day or yom to be a long but finite period of time. So my next question, Hugh, is with the theory of evolution, because or Darwinian evolution, because I know this is one of the sticking points for a lot of Christians, and I know myself, even young Christians, they may be brought up in a church and they're taught that, yeah, God created everything, but when they go to university, perhaps studying medicine or something like that, they're exposed to this evolutionary model. Could you just flesh out um, your views on the evolution model, and its strengths and negatives, and how it relates to the evidence that we see?
Well, let me make a bridge here because we're just talking about these days of creation. And the Bible is 66 separate books. And so, how we come up with a correct interpretation of the Bible is say we're going to take the content on science and creation literally, but consistently, because this is really the inspired Word of God. The book of Hebrews is not going to contradict the book of Genesis. And so, the fact that Hebrews 4 says that we're still in God's day of rest is a significant text. The same principle applies to science. Before we draw a conclusion on what the record of nature is saying, we need to integrate across all the scientific disciplines. And as I've engaged evolutionary biologists, I notice that they seem to be narrowly focused on genetics and paleontology. And so when I engage them, I say, another scientific discipline you need to take into account is solar astrophysics. And of course, that shocks them. And I said, well, the very fact is the sun is getting brighter and brighter as it continues to fuse hydrogen to helium. We know that the sun's about 23% brighter today than it was at the origin of life. And this poses a problem for how we interpret the history of life on planet Earth, because life is very sensitive to temperature. And if you got the sun's brightness increasing by 23%, that means you only get a narrow window in which life can exist on Earth, unless you have life progressively pulling greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. So yes, the sun is getting brighter and brighter, but if the greenhouse effect of Earth's atmosphere can be dropped down to perfectly compensate for the brightening of the sun, then you can have an optimal temperature on the surface of the Earth for a long period of time. And but that requires removing life from planet Earth on a regular cycle and replacing it with new life that's more efficient at pulling greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. But it has to have the just right efficiency to perfectly compensate for the sun's increasing luminosity. And a point I've made in a number of my books, only a mind that knows the future physics of the Earth and the sun will know which light to pull away from Earth at specific times and what new light to replace it with. And you actually see that in the Bible. It's in Psalm 104, verses 29 and 30, where the psalmist states it's the property of all life to die off, but God recreates and renews the face of the Earth. And I think that gives us a better understanding what's happening in the fossil record. As you look at the fossil record, about every 30 to 35 million years, there's a mass extinction event where 25 to 95% of the species of life on planet Earth get wiped out. But following every mass extinction event, there's a mass speciation event where millions of new species are introduced upon the Earth. And in terms of how rapidly or how periodically you need to remove life from the Earth and replace it with new life that's more efficient in pulling greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, you want that to happen about once every 30 to 35 million years. And that's exactly what we see in the fossil record. So the fossil record actually reveals the optimal cycle for removing life from planet Earth and replacing it with new life. But again, only a super intelligent mind that knows all of physics would know which life to remove and which new life to bring upon the Earth, what kind of life that needs to be, how diverse it needs to be, and its abundance. So a mindless evolutionary process is not going to work, because very quickly you're going to get out of sync and the planet becomes permanently sterile.
Brilliant. Yeah, I like how you've linked the physics side of it with the biological aspect of evolution. I'm wondering, could you just explain for the audience the what we see in the fossil record in the first place, particularly with the hominids and maybe their brain size and skeletons, and how because and for a lot of the audience, so some of my students will learn at in the biology textbook that the Darwinian model says it's small incremental changes over time that is what the model predicts. However, what we see in the fossil record is something different. Could you just talk about that? Thanks.
Yeah, this applies to the entire fossil record. The naturalistic evolutionary models predict that you're going to get differentiation at the species level, which eventually is going to lead to new genera, which eventually is going to lead to new orders, and then new classes and new phyla. And that the changes are going to be most rapid at the species level and least rapid at the phyla level. The problem is, when you look at the fossil record, it's the exact opposite. The phyla show up first, and they show up rapidly, and they show up in bunches. And later on, you see the classes and the orders and the genera and the species. So it's the exact opposite of what you'd expect from a naturalistic perspective, but is exactly what you'd expect from a God that's intent on perfectly compensating for the changing physics of the sun, that you would expect the phyla to show up first, to show up suddenly, and to show up with several phyla all at once. I mean, you particularly see that in the Avalon and Cambrian explosions in the fossil record. And then when you get closer to the present, you see that the changes observed in the fossil record, again, are the opposite of what you expect from a naturalistic perspective. You mentioned the bipedal primates. Again, from an evolutionary perspective, you would anticipate the bipedal capability would gradually evolve step by step through species over a period of 6 million years. But that's not what we see. And instead of having a gradual increase, it jumps up and down. And the most recent bipedal primate that preceded human beings was Homo florensis 18,000 years ago. And yet its cranial capacity is only 1/4 that of a human. It's the same as that of a chimpanzee. So you actually get the smallest brain at the end of the line, not the beginning of the line. And if you look at the whole 6.5 billion years of bipedal primate history, the brain size relative to the body size, it's not linear. It goes up and down like this. So, and it's a common story in physical anthropology that every time they discover a new fossil, it throws the evolutionary model into greater chaos rather than less chaos.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. Um, let's moving away from biology, because I think you have laid out that the point really well, where we don't see a consistent small incremental changes in the fossil record, which I think, for me as a scientist, I'm not a biologist, and I know there are theistic evolutionists who obviously adhere to the evolutionary model. However, for me, it's a problem of the science, um, and I just don't see sufficient evidence in the fossil record, at least, to support the Darwinian model. At the microevolution, for sure, we see that every day with bacteria mutating and so on. But with
Yeah,
the pre
there are
gone, yeah.
experiments that demonstrate that with terrestrial mammals, if the adult body size is bigger than 3 kilograms, they go extinct before they can experience any significant evolution. Notice all the bipedal primates for the past 6.5 million years have adult body sizes way larger than that.
Yeah.
Or tells us their population levels were low. Neanderthals probably never exceeded a population size worldwide that was greater than 15,000. And so if you got that few individuals, that means the possibility of evolutionary change is virtually zero. And so again, this is evidence that's not just humanity that's a product of special creation. These bipedal primates also were special creation events.
Yeah, and that's a really good point that Dr. Ross has mentioned, and I also want to bring out this fact with which you can do your research on our listeners. Homo erectus, just a small fact here, and correct me, Dr. Ross, on my numbers here, but believed to be 2 million years ago to 400 to 100,000 years was when they were believed to existed on this planet. Their skeletal structure in that time span pretty much stayed the same.
Right.
And 2 million to 400 to 100,000 years of no morphological change. And again, it's just supporting what Dr. Ross has mentioned there, with the mutation rates and so on. But that is just a bit of evidence for you to consider there, for our listeners. The other point I want to talk about, Dr. Ross, now is, I like, because I've read in your book A Matter of Days, which is this book here for our listeners. I will put a link to where you can find that. But um, could you please talk through how you the science of how you get from day 3 to day 4, and link that to the scripture, of what is happening on day 4, uh, from your understanding of scripture and from a scientific point of view as well. Thanks.
Well, being educated in Canada, I was taught the scientific method at every single grade level. We got it every year. And so when I picked up a Bible, that's kind of how I approached it, and was rather shocked to discover the scientific method right on the first page. I mean, step 1 of the scientific method is do not interpret until you establish the point of view or the frame of reference. Step 2 is don't interpret until you establish the initial conditions. And you see that in Genesis 1:2. The Spirit of God is hovering over the surface of the waters of planet Earth. And then it gives you the 4 starting conditions. It's dark everywhere on the surface. Water covers the whole surface. The earth is empty of life and unfit for life. And so you get into Genesis 1:3, creation day 1. It says, let there be light. It doesn't use the word create. It doesn't use the word made. In Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And I wasn't sure what the heavens and the earth meant when I first looked at it. But if you go through the entire Old Testament, you never see the word universe. But you see this phrase 9 times, the heavens and the earth. And if you look at those 9 passages, it's clear it's referring to the entire universe. So in the beginning, God created the universe. There was light throughout the universe, but it was dark on the surface of planet Earth. And Job 38, verses 8 and 9 tells us why it's dark. It says it's dark because God blanketed the seas with clouds that kept the light out. And as a young astronomy student, I knew planet Earth began with a much thicker atmosphere than it has today. An atmosphere so thick, no visible light would get through to the surface. But on creation day 1, the atmosphere is thinned out. We now know exactly how Earth lost its heavy atmosphere. It was through a collision event with another planet. But that would have allowed light from the universe to come through to the surface of the Earth. But the initial Earth's atmosphere was extremely hazy, so hazy that the light would get through, but creatures on the surface would have no idea what the sources of the light were. But on creation day 4, it says, "Let there be the great lights," referring to the sun, moon, and stars, that they may serve as signs to mark seasons, days, and years. And that's the first time that light on the surface of the Earth, animals in particular, would be able to see the sun, moon, and stars in the sky. And in 2018, a research paper was published by a team of physicists. Where in the lab, they simulated the Earth's early atmosphere, and then they added the oxygen to the flask in proportion to the oxygenation events that happened in Earth's history. And what they discovered was with an oxygen level below 1%, the Earth's atmosphere is so hazy, you're not even going to be able to see an object that's a mile away. And you're certainly be able to see the sun, moon, and stars. But as the oxygen content rises from 1% to 8%, the atmosphere becomes transparent. And we now know from the fossil record and from geology that there was a huge oxygenation event just before the first animals showed up. And so that would have allowed enough oxygen for animals to exist, but also made the atmosphere clear enough that those animals could see the sun, moon, and stars. And for animals, that's essential. They need to know the positions of the sun, moon, and stars on a regular basis in order to regulate their biological clocks. Critique of some atheists, they'll look at Genesis and say, hey, creation day 3, it's mentioning fruit trees. And we know fruit trees occurred very late in the fossil record, not as early as what the Bible says. But what they're failing to acknowledge is that creation day 3, once we have continents on the face of the Earth, it says let these land masses proliferate with vegetation. It uses the Hebrew word dasheh, which is a very general term for photosynthetic life. And then it gives 3 examples. It talks about fruit, seeds, and trees. And those are Hebrew words that are way more generic than the English equivalents. I mean, that's the challenge. A lot of these science-based controversies are unique to the English language. And that's because English has a huge vocabulary size, the largest in the world, largest that ever existed. And Biblical Hebrew, which is the basis for the Old Testament, has an extremely small vocabulary. And therefore, we have to be careful not to overinterpret some of these English translations. So yeah, it says, let the land produce vegetation, and then it gives 3 examples. It's not meant to be a complete list. And paleontologists were saying we have no fossil evidence for vegetation on the continents previous to the animals. Well, today we do. Discoveries were made starting in 2006, 2009. A paper got published just a few weeks ago documenting, although we don't have complete fossils of vegetation, previous to the appearance of animals, we got parts of those fossils. And the fossil parts and the isotope evidence tells us that vegetation was abundant on the continents for at least 600 million years before the appearance of the first animals. So this is a modern day example of how a debate between atheists and Christians on Genesis 1 has been resolved in favor but the Bible and the Christian interpretation.
Thank you, Dr. Ross. Yeah, that's very very helpful. Yeah, and before I introduce the next book and the next topic I want to discuss with Dr. Ross is, one thing Dr. Ross has mentioned, and he talks to lots of skeptics, and he says, and RTB present a creation model, and what he says to the skeptics is, look at what we see. Let's just wait and see what the evidence supports. Does it support a secular view or a Christian, or the creation model we present? And that's a scientific question that you can ask yourself, and just wait out the evidence. Is the evidence pointing towards a secular, non-theistic worldview where there doesn't seem to be any designer, or is the evidence somehow following what the Bible points to, which is design and order. And segueing nicely into that is this next book, Hidden Treasures in the Book of Job, which I'd recommend, where Dr. Ross highlights the predictive power of the Old Testament. And especially, well, obviously, the Book of Job in the Bible is believed to be one of the oldest books, older than Genesis, and there's a lot of interesting stuff there. And in particular, Dr. Ross, could you please highlight for our listeners how particular passages there relate to the expansion of the universe, and how does dark energy potentially come into that? But yeah, if you could please expand on how. Yeah.
Sure. Well, I wrote that book because Job is the most science-heavy book in the entire Bible. And I do believe it's the oldest book in the Bible, and therefore it makes sense that God, in inspiring the book of Job, would give the foundation from nature that would help people realize that there has to be a God that designed it this way. And yet, the book of Job mentions the beginning of the universe and the expansion of the universe. The book of Isaiah is the most detailed Old Testament book on cosmology. In fact, I think there's 7 texts in the book of Isaiah that mention the expansion of the universe. And often it's missed by the English readers of the text, because most verses would be, God stretches out the heavens. But the Hebrew verb for stretch out is the verb natah, which means expansion. And so 11 times by 6 different Old Testament authors, we have this reference to God expanding the universe. And a lot of people said, well, Hugh, you're just reading this into the text because you're a 21st century astronomer. And it was a theologian who was fluent in Hebrew, John Ray, who explained to me, hey, if you look at those 11 texts, the verb natah shows up in all 3 Hebrew verb forms, which means this can't be figures of speech. The text is literally talking about an expansion of the universe from a cosmic beginning. And I'm not alone in drawing that conclusion. John Ray is not alone. You can go back hundreds of years. Jewish theologians, looking at the Old Testament 800, 900 years ago, drew the same conclusions from the text, long before any astronomer realized our measurements really do show that the universe is expanding. And what impressed me before I became a Christian, not only does the Bible repeatedly talk about a beginning, including a beginning of space and time itself, and the expansion of the universe from that beginning, it tells us that the laws of physics have not changed. And Ecclesiastes and Romans speaks about this pervasive law of decay, how everything in the universe is decaying. There's this universal law of entropy. And I realized the Bible is actually telling us thousands of years ago, it's Big Bang cosmology. Because Big Bang cosmology declares the universe has a beginning, the universe expands, and as it expands, the universe gets colder and colder as it gets older and older. And any system that's expanding under constant laws of physics, where one of those laws is a law of entropy or a law of decay, it will get colder and colder in a highly predictable way. And in several of my books, I actually show measurements that astronomers have made of the past history of the universe and how they perfectly fit what the Bible would predict about the temperature decline of the universe, given that we know the age of the universe. We now have 14 measurements of the past temperature of the universe. Yeah, and it perfectly fits what the Bible declared thousands of years ago.
Thank you, Dr. Ross. That's extremely helpful, and yeah, no, I resonate a lot with that, and I find that, I'm just, normal Christian here, or just normal person, and if you just really get what Dr. Ross has mentioned there, he said there are several verses which say that God stretches out or expands. The Hebrew, the universe. This was before telescopes, before were invented, before humans thought that the Earth went around the sun compared to the Earth being still and the sun orbiting around us. That for me just speaks of it has to be inspired by somebody outside of space and time. You know, um, so for me that is very, very powerful. Predictive power of the Bible there. The next question, Hugh, I would like to talk about is, and maybe a bit of a history lesson for some of the listeners here, is the Big Bang theory and how it came into existence. Because I know a lot of young Earth creationists will say, "Oh, Dr. Ross is is a kind of like maybe a false teacher or whatever, or is leading Christians away with his ideology, or old Earth creationism in general, which accounts for millions of years." But historically, astronomers and scientists were actually very opposed to the Big Bang model, because they wanted, or at least they thought the universe was static and that it didn't have a beginning. But the evidence just got so overwhelming that they had to subscribe to the Big Bang model. And again, we have Genesis 1 saying, "In the beginning, God created." And then our current mainstream science in astronomy and cosmology does say that our universe did at some point in the past have a beginning. Um, Dr. Ross, could you just go through some of the evidences for the Big Bang theory for us, because it is right up your street as an astronomer. Um,
Yeah, I write about this in my book, The Fingerprint of God, how Big Bang cosmology had its origin in Einstein's theory of general relativity. Because if you actually look at the equations of general relativity and solve them, it tells us that the universe has a beginning. And when Einstein saw that, he says, I got to fix these equations, because the predominant model at that time was the universe was infinitely old. And so he put a fudge factor in the equations to take away the beginning. But what happened was astronomers began to measure the velocities of galaxies and saw that they were moving away from us, exactly as you would expect if the universe had a beginning and was expanding from that beginning. So later in his life, Einstein said, that was the biggest blunder I ever made in my career. And he went back to the way his equations were. And during the early part of the 20th century, astronomers were making more extensive measurements farther and farther away from the Earth. And then they discovered that indeed the universe was getting colder and colder in a manner exactly predicted by Big Bang cosmology. And so it was accumulation of measurements of what's happening to the galaxies, what's happening to the temperature of the universe, and the temperature differences in the universe. The Kobe satellite in the 1990s was the first time astronomers could actually see the temperature differentiation in the cosmic background radiation. And it's exactly what we predicted, if indeed the universe had a beginning. But throughout the 20th century, there was significant resistance. It wasn't just Einstein. Sir Arthur Eddington in Britain basically said, we have to get rid of this beginning, because if we have this beginning, we got a beginner. And he said, that's repugnant to my philosophy. And then you had other British astronomers like, Fred Hoyle, basically promoting the idea, well, maybe the universe is expanding, so we can't deny that, but maybe there's continuous creation going on. So he came up with a steady state model. But again, astronomical observation said, as we look far away, the universe looks younger. steady-state cosmology said we're going to see the same ages everywhere, but that wasn't the case. We could actually see the universe start off without any stars and galaxies at all. Then the first stars form, first galaxies form. We can actually see the galaxies age as you go from very distant, because the farther away you look, the farther back in time you see because of the velocity of light. So, and what I find remarkable, we humans live at a time in the history of the universe, the only time in the history of the universe where we can use our telescopes to see the entire history of the universe and actually image the very event of creation. We have telescopes that can show us what the universe was like by direct observations when the universe was only 100 billionth of a trillionth of a trillionth of a second old, and literally observe the history of the universe all the way up to the present day. And so it reached a point where even the atheist astronomer said, we have to accept the fact that there's a beginning. And, in my books, I have a quote from one of the authors of the space-time theorems, Alexander Vilenkin, who says cosmologists cannot escape the fact that there's a beginning. Like it or not, there is a beginning. And that beginning implies there has to be some causal agent that brought the universe into existence. And so what I'm seeing amongst my peers in astronomy who are not Christians, they will say we're atheists, but if you press them, they're really deists. They do admit that there has to be a causal agent, but they insist that the causal agent is not a personal being, and not a personal being that's watching how we live our lives. However, that's where the fine-tuning evidence, I think, overthrows that, because the fine-tuning of the universe is so pervasive and so remarkably fine-tuned that it tells us there has to be a being that's way more intelligent than us, way more powerful, and way more knowledgeable that brought the universe into existence. And so it's not just a deistic God, it's a personal God.
Brilliant, thank you. That's very, very helpful. And for our listeners, please do what Dr. Ross is saying. Yeah, I went to university, studied physics. This is the same thing that you'll learn about. So it's not because I know a lot of my non-Christian friends will say, well, science doesn't. How can you believe Genesis 1? But actually, I was surprised at university. Big Bang cosmology is the accepted model, and that just fits wonderfully with Genesis 1. Brilliant. And I want to move on now. Now, for those listeners, in fact, it links nicely to what Dr. Ross has been saying. Dr. Ross has debated lots and lots of well-respected scholars around the world. One of them is Peter Atkins, who is a retired chemist from Oxford, who and it's a really, really good debate. I'd recommend the listeners. I'll put a link to it in the description. But one of the questions Peter Atkins and a lot of, I'm sure, my non-Christian friends will ask is, well, right, Dr. Ross, yes, fine, there was a beginning, and you say God did it. Who created God? This is even my students at school, and this is the most common question. Wondering what is your response, Dr. Ross, to that question? Who created God?
Well, Peter Atkins posed that question. He's not alone. Many scientists and lay people pose the same question. But it's assuming that the creator of the universe is constrained to a single dimension of time like we are and universe is. Any entity that's constrained to just one dimension of time, where time cannot be stopped or reversed, must have some kind of creation point. There must be some ultimate creation point. But what the space-time theorems prove is that there is a beginning to all the space-time dimensions of the universe. There's a causal agent outside of time that created time. So the creator of the universe is not constrained to linear time. According to the space-time theorems, he can create space-time dimensions at will and remove them at will. Therefore, the idea of who created God God's in a different category. He's the creator of space-time dimensions. He's not even subject to dimensions. And therefore, for him, there is no need for ultimate beginning. There is for anything that's constrained to the universe. So for us, for all life, for the universe itself, yes, because of it being constrained to one dimension at a time, there must be some cause for that. But because the creator of the universe is actually the author of all dimensions, he alone does not need a cause. He's always been there.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ross. And I completely agree with that. Just briefly, because I see time is running away for us. I would like to talk about death, and this is mainly for my my Christian friends or young Earth creationists there, because they will claim that God says it was very good in the days prior to day 6 and so on. And they say, well, how can you have death prior to the fall of Adam? Um, could you just flesh out how you come to terms with that, and potentially where do dinosaurs fit in with the creation account, and God's purpose with that? Thanks.
Right. Well, the two texts would be Romans 5:12 through 19 and 1 Corinthians 15:20 to 22. Those two New Testament texts tell us that when Adam rebelled against God, introduced sin into the human population, that's when humans died. And so basically it's making the point that until Adam sinned, there was no human death. Now, nowhere in the Bible does it talk about the lack of animal or plant death. When you look at Romans 5:12, it says death through sin was visited upon all people. Well, there's only one species of life that's ever existed on planet Earth that's capable of sin, and that's us human beings. So it's death through sin. And it says it was visited upon all people. It does not say all life, it says all people. So Adam's sin brought death to humanity for the first time. It has nothing to do with the death of plants and animals. And it's thanks to the death of plants and animals long before Adam existed that we humans have coal, oil, natural gas, marble, limestone, and gypsum. We have over 76 quadrillion tons of biodeposits in the crust of the earth, thanks to the death of plants and animals that preceded us. And because of all those biodeposits, we humans have been able to launch and sustain global civilization. And if you read the Bible, that global civilization is crucial for taking the good news of salvation through Jesus Christ to all the people groups of the world. That would not have been possible without all those biodeposits. Now, you had a second point to your question. I forgot what your second point was.
It was the dinosaurs, but I think you mentioned it with the yeah, you mentioned yeah, and that was very helpful. So yeah, just to reiterate what Dr. Ross has mentioned there, when God says in Genesis 1, it was good, in the respective days. Dr. Ross is pointing out the fact that if we didn't have animal death of these early organisms, we would not have those useful biodeposits, just coal, oil, and gas to launch civilization. And so actually it was good. And this just shows the mind of God, how he's above and beyond what a normal human can imagine or think as good.
Well,
Um,
let's
go
talk
on.
about good.
Yeah.
Okay, you see this throughout Genesis 1. With
Mm,
each creation day, it's good, and at the end it says it's very good. And you mentioned younger creations as saying, hey, if there's death before Adam, how can God say it's very good? Well, it's the very best possible creation for God to use the creation to eradicate evil and suffering once and for all. This is the very good creation. It's the best possible creation for God to eradicate evil quickly and efficiently. But there's a new creation coming. And the new creation, there will be no decay. There will be no death. It's going to be governed by radically different physics. And Jesus said in the Gospel of John, In this world you'll have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. As it says in the book of Ecclesiastes and Romans, we live in a universe with entropy. Things are decaying. Everything is decaying. And that explains, in this world you'll have tribulation. Or as a physicist, I could say, in this world you'll have thermodynamics. If you got thermodynamics, bad things are going to happen. However, once evil has been eradicated by God, the universe will have fulfilled its purpose. God will replace it with a brand new realm, the new realm we see in Revelation 21 and 22. That's the ultimate creation. And that's what impressed me about Christianity when I was comparing it with the other religions of the world during my teenage years. What we see in the Bible is a two creation model, two creations that are distinct from one another. Yes, the other religions speak about heaven, but the heavens they speak about are just basically an improved version of what we're already experiencing. Whereas in the Bible, we get a radically different realm. So the first creation is a segue to the perfect creation, the ultimate creation.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ross. That's very, very helpful there. Yeah, new creation, which is mentioned in Revelation for our listeners there, and again, from a theological point of view, not a scientific point of view. Again, that speaks of the mind of God, how He's got direction, and I think especially with COVID, the global pandemic, we can, even as Christians, get so negative. Oh, what is God doing? But actually, if we look at what is in Scripture, the initial creation, God's initial plan, with the biodeposits, but also Revelation looking forwards, there's a second creation. That we have a huge hope as Christians in just the direction God has for humanity. Finally, Dr. Ross, is as we come to a close, thank you again for your time. Is obviously this is gonna be, this issue amongst Christians is always a touchy one. We want to reiterate it is of secondary importance to the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ and the gospel message that we want to proclaim, which is the forgiveness of sins and new life found in Jesus. I'm wondering, and what can we do as a church to kind of, because I know in John it says by our love for one another, Christian brothers and sisters, that's going to be a witness to non-Christians. What can we as a church do to resolve this old earth, young earth debate? Do you think moving forward?
Well, having been a student of church history, I've noticed that Christians have consistently divided and fought one another over the non-essentials of the Christian faith. You even see in the book of Acts, Christians were divided over the issue of circumcision. And today we have the issue of the age of the earth. It's not in any of the creeds of the church. It's not essential for any of the particular doctrines that are pertinent to salvation. But it tells us in 2 Corinthians 5 that we Christians are ambassadors for peace, calling people who are not yet believers to make their peace with God and to come into the family of God. But I think we Christians have to be aware non-Christians are watching how we treat one another. And it was Jesus who said, "They'll know you're my followers by your love for one another." And to me, the ultimate test of that love is how we treat one another when we sharply disagree. And so I think it's important that Christians disagree. It's through our disagreements that we can test and challenge one another and dig deeper and find more of the truth that we've not yet uncovered. So it's important that we tolerate these disagreements. But it's the way we disagree that's going to make an impact on the world. And so I'm exhorting my young earth brothers, we need to treat one another with love and respect. Stop calling one another names. Stop using emotional cues, because we're being watched. And When I became a Christian, I recognized that one of the commitments of being a follower of Jesus Christ was to share my Christian faith with people who are not yet believers. And as I read through the Bible, I recognize it's consistent with what I call an evangelistic hermeneutic. Every book of the Bible has been given to us as a tool that we can use to bring people into the family of God. And therefore, we need to use that as a means for discerning what is the book of nature really telling us, and how can we apply that to bring people to faith in Christ. And therefore, taking that evangelistic hermeneutic, being committed to evangelism, and getting feedback from your non-Christian friends. I mean, when I first started sharing my faith, I would say, hey, it looks like I offended you. Can you tell me how I offended you? And what can I do so I don't make this mistake again? And I've discovered that non-Christians are quite eager at pointing out my faults and trying to show me where I've been obnoxious. But we Christians need to do that with one another. Basically take advice from one another, critique from one another, so that our love for one another will grow. That's why we're here, is to experience more intimacy and love with God and with one another.
Thank you, Dr. Ross. And yeah, and that brings the end to this podcast, or this discussion with Dr. Ross and myself. We hope that that is really important what Dr. Ross mentioned there in his last statement there. By our love for one another will those around us come to know Christ. And again, and I just want to say, I've got lots of young Earth creationist friends, and we disagree in love. But I would say also to my non-Christian friends, what I hope you will get from watching this or listening to Dr. Ross is at least, you don't have to commit intellectual suicide to become a Christian. There are ways where you can reconcile mainstream science, and I'm hoping in today's video from some of what Dr. Ross has mentioned with his Big Bang cosmology and the emergence of the Big Bang theory and the need for a cause in the distant past, points to a creator, and also just the inadequacies of Darwinian evolution at the present state, with the fossil record, and yeah, just the order of events in Genesis 1. And again, we mentioned the Hebrew word yom, how it could be translated as a finite period of time. Thank you, Dr. Ross, for your time once again, and God bless you in your ministry. I will put just before we go, Navigating Genesis, I'd recommend, where Dr. Ross highlights the first 11 chapters and gives his thoughts on that. And some of what we talked about was on the hominids, who was Adam. Again, is a really good book, but I will put links to all these in the description below. Have you got anything else to add, Dr. Ross? Or I will
just for your viewers and listeners, they can get 3 chapters of any of my books just by going to reasons.org/Ross.
Brilliant. There we go. reasons.org/Ross. And I'll put that in the link. Thank you, Dr. Ross, for your time, and God bless all those that are listening.
Well, thank you.